For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome. You're on StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. It's been almost a year since the Galwan clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers took place in the high altitude region of Ladakh. Much water has flown down in the Indus River, and much has happened after that event or that episode, which sent ripples across the world, because that was the first armed clash or a first clash where deaths occurred between Indian and Chinese soldiers on the line of actual control after 1975. So what has changed? What has not? What is the way forward? Is the discussion in this special series, Galwan, 1 year on, we are doing on StratNews Global. And joining me in this discussion are two very distinguished experts on the India-China issue or on South Asia. Lt Gen Rakesh Sharma, who was the Adjutant General of the Indian Army, but more than that, he's a specialist on the Chinese affairs, being a scholar at the IDSA, as well as the 14 Corps commander when the previous standoff happened in 2013 in Ladakh. That was almost a 3-week standoff. And valuable lessons were learned from there, hopefully, which have been implemented in the current ongoing, I would say, the standoff on the LAC in Ladakh. And joining me from Sydney is South Asia scholar with Stanford University, Arzan Tarapore, who's written extensively on India-China issues, and in fact has been commenting on the relationship between India and China and the cleavage that has taken place between India and China of late because of the Ladakh crisis. Welcome both of you, gentlemen. But before I start, let me just say this, that 1 year after Galwan, we still don't have any clarity of where we stand and where we are going. But let me start with General Sharma and ask him that when you look back 1 year ago, when the Galwan clash happened, what were your first thoughts then? And when you see it after a gap of 1 year, what are your thoughts and what are the implications of that particular clash? If I can start with you, General Sharma.
Thank you, Nitin, for inviting me. It's a historic time. It's been 1 year, a little more than 1 year than what happened there. Now, let me put it this way, that if we feel that we were not surprised in May last year, that would be a mistaken thing. We were surprised. What happened was not expected at that time, because there was a bonhomie, a kind of bonhomie with all these protocols and CBMs and agreements over a period of time and all the discussions that were happening at political space. So at May, there was a difference. Now, subsequently, consequent to May, there have been much changes and much consequences that have happened that we have to learn from. Firstly, let me put it this way, that it soon dawned on us that this was not an unintended or a casual operation being carried out by the PLA. This was carried out as a first time over multiple points. There were multiple incursions carried out, or transgressions as it is called. There were also multiple places where clashes started off in the month of May last year. There was first time also that he brought 2 divisions here. Now, naturally, he's got training areas close to Shaidullah, which is called 30 Barracks or something, is the road between Kunlun Mountain and Karakoram. He has a training area, but he brought these divisions, placed them into this area, which hasn't been done earlier. So it was the first time that this was carried out. That's also. Third point is that it's also the first time it happened that there was no withdrawal that normally took place. Now, you rightly pointed out 2013, there was a 22-day blockade in the area of Rakhi Nala, which is in Depsang Plateau. And but it finally amicably sorted out and it moved ahead. And in between, there were a number of other incidents that took place at various places, but the banner drill came through and the BPMs took place and it was sorted out. This is the third issue where this time the clash happened and they did not go back. So that was a dramatic shift into what was happening over a long period of time. And then the fourth major issue is that Chinese started constructing defenses, a kind of things that we not seen earlier, sangers, on finger 4, finger 5, which everybody knows now. He started developing some kind of defensive structure. We have not seen defensive structures being made by the Chinese ever in a history of last 60, 70 years. So there was a transformative thing that happened. And the last issue I want to raise is Galwan. Now, Galwan happened. There was a major incident. We were wanting to check as to whether Chinese are withdrawn or not, consequent to discussions at the CO level. But there was a clash in which we lost 20 soldiers. And it also gives out some other facts. Now, I'd say that did Chinese mean action? Did it come for war? Here, I wish to go back to my what I've been writing and speaking. The Chinese certainly did not come for war. They did not come for a full conventional war. They came for a purpose. Like you said, it's not been actually brought out, but I'll take a shy at. He came despite what happened in Galwan. They were still only bludgeons. There was no firing or troops that took place. Similar things on the line of control, they would have been firing in large number of casualties, but it didn't happen there. There was no trigger for a border war of a kind. See, there was nothing that happened on the central sector, nothing happened on the eastern sector. It was narrowly related only to areas of the Aksai chain. Not so much of forces shifted toward Demchok or Chumar. There was no armor seen in those areas. So it was narrowly stated. So there was a distinct focus to what China was carrying out. So it was not war that they were aiming at. He didn't have extraordinary reserves to carry out an operation of this kind. And then I would state that, afterwards, 1959 line has been spoken hundreds of times, and people say Chinese wanted 59 line, and Chinese spokespersons have also been talking about 59 line. But finally, Chinese, when they came and did the transgressions in a surreptitious manner, they did not reach 1959 line everywhere. They came, maybe in Fingers area, they came to 59 line, but they did not reach in the Chishur area. They did not reach the 59 line even in Depsang area or Chumar or Demchok. So you can't even say it's 59 line. So I'll, discuss this issue further, but to suffice it to say, for me, it was a question of just intimidation, coercion. It is just a question of putting us under tremendous amount of pressure into Ladakh areas and elsewhere as we did. And that was the major aim that he brought across. Whether the end state when the Chinese wanted got achieved or not is discussable issue. But he wanted to bring himself to a position which is not the 59 line totally, but wherever he came, he stood there and he stood firm there. We have learned a large number of lessons, and we can discuss as we progress here.
Yes, we will do that. But Arzan, you heard General Sharma give a nice, complete descriptor of what militarily the Chinese wanted to do. But let me expand the discussion a little bit and take you to your own recent paper that you have written. That while the Chinese, and there has been a limited disengagement on the South Bank and in Pangangso, as we all are aware, and it's an ongoing discussion, and it might happen, it may not happen. But to look at the larger picture that you have spoken about, when you look at the costs imposed on both the sides, the Chinese have incurred less cost, and India has incurred greater cost, and it will have consequences for India's modernization, is what you have said. If you want to explain that a little bit, and why do you say that? Because then we will take that further into a discussion.
Sure thing. Thank you very much, Nitin, for having me, and thank you for raising this argument. People can read about it at length online, but let me briefly summarize the points that I'm making. The point is that essentially the long-term effect of the Ladakh crisis, whatever happens with disengagement, is that it has created at two levels, both an operational level on the ground as well as a political level between Delhi and Beijing, a new status quo. On the ground operationally, it has created a situation where both sides have increased their deployments near the LAC, again, regardless of what happens with the specifics of disengagement, in what we're calling depth areas or rear areas, both sides have built infrastructure to sustain a larger force presence, a force presence which is also more proximate to the other side than it previously was. And so that creates simply the material costs of sustaining heavy deployments, new heavy deployments on the LAC. It also creates a slightly increased risk over the longer term. Certainly during crises, it's a greatly increased risk. And so at that level, at the operational level, we have the literal increased costs of having to sustain a large quantum of forces on the LAC. The other type of risk, though, is at the broader level. I would suggest that India-China relations, as Delhi has made clear, are not going back to the status quo ante until the border, right? New Delhi has made clear that there's no idea of shelving this border dispute and getting on with trade relations or getting on with a general improvement in relations until this is resolved. So there is now a new status quo bilaterally of antagonism and suspicion, unlike what we had before May of 2020. What that means for India is that it cannot trust Chinese intentions or cannot trust Chinese statements or plans either on the border or anywhere else. And what that means in terms of defense planning for India is that it has to take seriously the ongoing risk of future Chinese aggression on the LAC. Now, politically, of course, when soldiers' lives have been lost and when there is an ongoing threat to Indian sovereignty, that means that the Indian military cannot but place a large focus, a high priority on securing the land border. And my concern is that, especially as resources are scarce for the military, as defense budgets are not rising, that is going to come at the expense of other defense investments that would help to modernize all the services, including the army, but also it's going to come at the expense of India's force projection into the Indian Ocean. So in particular, the maritime expansion into the Indian Ocean region, which is not going to stop entirely, but which required a larger investment in order to maintain certain levels of capabilities, now that is at risk. Now, this is all still supposition. This is all just projecting the risk that may come. Right? Things may not turn out this way. My analysis is that because of what has happened in Ladakh, there is an increased risk that modernization will be further deferred and the rebalance to the Indian Ocean will be further deferred.
Well, I think your point of view is what you have said and you have written, but it can be argued the other way, that because the crisis has occurred in Ladakh, India is now rebalancing and reorienting its forces and its, I would say, planning towards the northern border, which was long overdue, although it had begun some 10-15 years ago, but it will be speeded up. So in a way, it's a blessing in disguise that the Chinese have made their intentions clear. And therefore, India is now taking steps to redress that imbalance that must have been there in the planning, because Pakistan was seen as I wouldn't say the main threat, but it was a ever-present threat in the mind, which now seems to have receded, and China has come into the picture. Then what would have otherwise taken some more time. And similarly, I think in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Navy's predominance or dominant presence is still, I think, going to remain for at least another 5-6 years. And by that time, India would find money and would find means to modernize its navy to counter any increased Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. Could be a counter argument. But let me take this to General Sharma and ask him that how has it impacted the Ladakh crisis and as well as the increased distrust between India and China, the overall relationship, as well as what does it mean for the Indian Army's future planning, not just modernization, but its doctrines, its practices, and its war planning, as they say, as far as the two adversaries are concerned.
That's a wholesome question. Now, Nitin, firstly, let me start with whether it has made material change to budget has been rightly brought out by Arzan. Now, the fact of the matter is that our defense budget has kind of stagnated for a very long time. It is not 2020 or 2021. We had a little kind of stagnation coming up for a very long period, 6, 7 years, even more. We were down to 1.5 or little thereabouts of the GDP, and it is not actually enhanced. So there was a problem. There are competing requirements in the national expenditure, and competing requirement. Defense is also one major requirement which has to be catered for. Now, in the course of what has happened in last 1 year, there is obviously, as you rightly pointed out, rebalancing being carried out from the western front to the northern front. There haven't been many raisings being executed. Of course, you hear that there is a talk about light tanks or a new MBT being created or those things. Those are long-term perspectives, and it is not right around the corner. So there hasn't been a significant let us say manpower enhancements being carried out on the northern front. It is just kind of sidestepping forces from there. So that's one part of it. But I agree with the thought process that to sustain such large quantum of people in an area which is already saturated with people looking after Siachen Glacier or Western Ladakh, and even previously Eastern Ladakh, and now reconfiguration of Eastern Ladakh, which you are aware was one division, now it is becoming two divisions being occupied, plus their reserves being, and see, finally, this distrust has been pointed out rightly, has led us to make sure that we have acclimatized reserves placed there, which wasn't there earlier. So you have now substantial acclimatized reserves which are available there, and they have to be turned over. So I agree with the thought process that logistically sustaining and maintaining, plus creating of habitats and roads and tracks, there will be a little problem into the defense budget which has to be catered for. It hasn't been done in the defense budget this year, but I'm sure in times things will come to that end. Whether there is a great amount of modernization being carried out in the army per se, I think it is going slow, but I don't think it is going slow for the Navy and the Air Force. It is not substantial, but to say that it has been stopped there, but they have a long-term vision and long-term plans, and they are committed liabilities over a long period of time for the Navy and Air Force, including the ships being built. So I think for the Navy and the Air Force, I think it's better. The Army has to start rethinking as to how we want to do the issues here. The second issue is about the doctrinal aspects, and I think I am in agreement largely in what Mr. Tarapore has been writing, and elsewhere also has been written, saying that there is a need for transforming the doctrinal structures. As the Prime Minister himself said, he used the word future force when he spoke in Kevadia in February this year. He said the armed forces should become a future force, and he also said there has to be indigenization of doctrines. I leave the word indigenization apart, but it must be a concerned feeling in the Prime Minister and the national security establishment that our doctrines are of the past. They are just been carried over for a very long period of time and not matched up with the changed character of warfare and the changed kind of adversaries that we have and the kind of wars that the adversaries will fight. Look, even if he had 4 casualties, it took him 8 months to tell his own people he had 4 casualties. He doesn't accept casualties. He had casualties 772 in 1962. I'm referring to China. I'm not calling him she. But 772 casualties happened in the 62 war. He announced it in 1994. See, there are issues here. The kind of war that Chinese want to fight, be absolutely clear. If he wants to do some great aggression, well, be rest assured, he will have a lot of body bags to be carried. So there is a transformative nature of warfare which is evident even in the actions of Chinese in the course of last 1 year. We need to prepare ourselves for a new character of war. And then, of course, I agree that we need to enunciate fresher doctrines, newer doctrines of the kind where we will able to absorb the onslaught the Chinese bring because of the technological force that he's got, and then also able to respond back to the technology in equal measure. There is need to be a transformation. Our increasing reliance on border per se, or defensive structures per se, I think we need to amend ourselves. So there, I accept the view that there needs to be a little change in doctrine structure. Also, the strategy, the end ways and means, if we don't have the ways, and then we'll have to start thinking as to what ends we want to achieve in the next war in 2030 or 35 in the same timelines the Chinese talk about. So we have to think about what is the compensatory end state we wish to gain in the next wars with the curtailed ways after COVID. After the pandemic is over, obviously there would be problems in the budget again. There will be again shortfalls because there's so many things to catch up with. We have to think. I think I agree with that notion that we have to rethink the typology of warfare that we're going to follow in times to come, and see get back to drafting boards and rewriting things.
Before I go to Arzan again, General Sharma, one small point about body bags. Galwan, since we are speaking 1 year after Galwan, there is this theory amongst some of the observers in India at least, that the Chinese do not want to accept body bags or are not willing to admit that there are casualties because they're not used to bloodshed, unlike the Indian military, especially the Indian army. How much of a psychological effect that kind of attitude or that kind of practice, when faced with body bags, will have on the Chinese thinking as far as warfare is concerned? Is that the reason why they are more into standoff warfare, or cyber and electronic warfare that they are indulging in, or is there something more to it?
Okay, Nitin, I'll take a step back. If I learn from 1 year and I go tactically again, I can't differentiate between tactical and strategic realm. It's same.
Yeah.
At Galwan itself, he started making a buffer, a kind of moratorium on patrolling. It was maybe 2, 3, 4 kilometers, but then it was decided mutually, okay, he goes so many kilometers behind PP14 and we have. Subsequently, when it came to bottleneck, there was again a gap being created in Depsang, where the PLA went about 2 kilometers behind and we came 2 kilometers behind. So there was a gap. Then subsequently, when this 10th round of talks, and we withdrew back from finger 4 and finger 5, where we were face to face, or on the Trishul heights, where or in the Kailash range, we were face to face, we disengaged. All these buffers that have been created over a period of time in last 1 year give rise to the fact that firstly he goes back to 1960 when he said he wanted 20 kilometers buffer. Here is not 20 kilometers buffer, but there are smaller buffers being created. He does not want to get into any fisticuffs because we have a changed rules of engagement now where we are empowered to give a fight, fire a bullet. So next injuries will be actually strongly body bags. We are, as you rightly said, nobody wants casualties, but we have the resilience to accept the casualties, while the Chinese is a separate story. Now I come to see internally, he has more internal security forces than he has PLA. Why does China have such large internal security forces, and why so intrusive kind of surveillance that he carries out? Because there are internal anxieties of a nation which is kind of totalitarian. There are serious anxieties that China has on its own front. Lest the people get angered and excited about. See, in a small incident, also the Weibo takes off, and there is whole lot of media, social media of China gets worked up even for 4 casualties. Suffice it to say that while we should not drag the issue of body bags too far, but that's an issue to remember. The issue to remember is that we have the capacity to take on the high altitude and inflict serious amount of casualties. Whether the Chinese can accept the casualties or they'll take 20 years to announce that they had 700 casualties is a separate issue altogether. But if he has casualties, it matters. Even now, there is a cemetery near Rudolph. On the road G219, there's a cemetery which is for 62 war. It is closed, it's an enclosed thing, and people do come stop sometime, and travelers and stop there. The, the culture of taking the bodies back to the villages or the townships where people died, to the families to do, it doesn't come normally in China. It comes normally in us. Why it doesn't happen? Because there is an anxiety in their mind that people will get worked up. I think we got to learn some positive lessons in this regard. There may be negative lessons to be learned, but I personally, this is my personal view, there are positive lessons to be learned. And then also comes to the issue which Mr. Tarapore has been raising. Maybe there is to be a doctrinal change as to how we're going to fight the wars.
Absolutely. So on that point, Arzan, coming to you, you also recommend in your paper, and I want a little more expansion of that thought, where you say focus on military strategies of denial rather than punishment, focus on imposing political rather than material cost on China. If you can explain these 2 points, what do you mean by more political cost? Is the body bags question a political cost, or is it something else that you moved from there?
That's a good question. Let me step through a couple of points. First, just to sort of respond to a couple of things that have been said, I completely agree that Ladakh has been a really important clarifying moment for India, clarifying the nature of the Chinese rivalry, right? Because previously there was a sense that maybe China was a country that India could work constructively with, and there were doubts over the strategic challenge posed by China. And so I think I agree completely that 2020 was a good clarifying moment in highlighting the kind of challenge that China poses. The problem is, it is, as General Sharma alluded to, a problem of ends and means, that while now there is a recognition that China is a priority issue, the means are not sufficient to do everything that India was previously doing, as well as now has to do. And so the challenge is going to be, first and foremost, prioritizing what are the most severe threats, and secondly, planning with a long-term time horizon. So when you say, for example, that the Indian Navy's position is going to be okay for the next 5, 6, let's even say 10 years in the Indian Ocean, maybe that's correct. But the problem is that the delta between the Indian and Chinese military capabilities in the IOR is shrinking so quickly that India is going to have to start taking action now in order to realize those effects 5 to 10 years from now. And so there is an urgency, even though it doesn't seem like that, because even though it seems that the urgent threat is on the land border, there is in fact an urgency to make hard decisions now, because the effects of those decisions won't be felt for another decade or so. Now, let me also quickly just address this issue of how India addresses the China challenge, right? Because exactly as General Sharma said, it's one thing to recognize the China threat, but it's another thing to think about how to actually deal with it, right? So there's a lot of anger in India, but throwing Chinese TVs off balconies is not the sort of thing that's going to deal with the China threat. In order to deal with the China threat, it's not about raising new formations. It's about looking at the nature of how China plans to fight wars and addressing India's critical weaknesses in that. And this is where I'll come to the denial and punishment issue as well. It's not just about how many divisions or corps face China. It's also about domains where India's Chief of Defense Staff has publicly stated India has a big asymmetric disadvantage. I'm talking about cyber, right? Where General Rawat has said, this is something that India may never catch up to China on, but this is something where, considering China's approach to warfighting, which is a much more holistic approach to warfighting than simply conventional military operations, as we saw with the Ladakh crisis, with probable Chinese cyber operations against Indian civilian cyber infrastructure, India is going to face a challenge. Should it come to conflict with China, India is going to face a challenge unlike it faced in 62, even though India is stronger than it was in 62, so is China. And the way that China is going to fight a war, it's not going to be measured by which side piles up body bags more quickly than the other. It's going to be measured by which side can defeat the system of the other side more quickly. And this is something that goes well beyond conventional military operations. Finally, let me just address your question about denial and punishment. The root of that argument is that in deterrence thinking, there are two ways to deter an adversary. You either absorb their attack and then punish them or threaten to punish them in order to deter that attack from happening in the first place, or you make that attack either impossible to execute or too costly to execute to be worth it. Indian doctrine to date has focused on punishment, the idea that India can and will absorb an initial attack by the aggressor, but that the threat of strike corps, even those that are redirected from the Pakistan front to the China front, will deter the adversary from misadventure. I mean, as we've seen in 2020, that did not deter the PLA from coming across and encamping across the LAC. And my concern is that the type of that China may have are not the types of objectives that will be deterred by punishment. So what India needs to do instead is to stop these incursions from happening in the first place, or make them so costly that they prove to be not worth it. And so, for example, what we saw with the occupation of the Kailash Heights was an act of denial. The Indian forces denied further ingress by the PLA and essentially created a cost upon China to say that that there is now leverage that India could trade away in disengagement talks. The other issue is the political versus material costs. The point that I was making in the paper was that the increased militarization of the LAC is something that the much bigger and much better resourced PLA can absorb much more easily than the Indian military can. The costs can be easily absorbed comparatively. The political cost is that China faced the prospect of a deterioration, a long-term permanent deterioration in India-China relations. Now, India very astutely sort of brandished that threat, saying that the trading relationship with us, this big Indian market, may come to an end if this crisis is not resolved. And it's that type of political threat that seems to have had more of an effect on decision makers in Beijing than the cost of militarizing the LAC, which is something that they wanted to do anyway. So it was a combination of the threats that India made during the crisis, as well as concurrent pressures on China that were happening at the same time, but unrelated to India, that helped to convince Beijing to perhaps change tack and disengage in the end.
Indeed, in fact, that's the correct perspective from both of you. That there is much more much more to India-China spat at the moment, or the kind of deterioration in the relationship that has happened, because militarization of LAC is one part, but India has cleverly expanded the ambit of the war of attrition with China by bringing in trade, bringing in technology, denying Huawei, for instance, any competition in 5G networks that are going to come in. Now, these are the costs that the Chinese would really not like to incur, while they can absorb the cost of higher militarization of the LAC. So I think there is much more work to be done on both sides. India has made it clear that it will not talk to China on other issues. The border and the current crisis cannot be brushed aside just to keep the other parts of relationship going. I think that's the start point for China to recognize where this relationship would go. And I think on that note, I must thank both of you for very insightful and very erudite and informed take on what's happening on the LAC and between India and China militarily. There are other aspects of the relationship which we will be talking to other experts and other observers of India-China relationship and the geopolitical context in which the current crisis is situated. But thank you, both of you, for joining me and kicking off this series, Galwan 1 Year On. Thank you very much, and we do hope to come back to you on many more occasions like this when we have a crisis or we don't have a crisis. But thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And viewers, so do keep watching StratNews Global. You know where to reach us. You know our YouTube channel. Do subscribe to it. You know our social media handles. And of course, keep sending us feedback on both our website as well as on the YouTube channel. You are on StratNews Global, and this is a special series on Galwan 1 Year On. I'm Nitin Gokhale.